Good morning, welcome to this session on expectations of radar in RYA practical exams, delivered by myself, Graham Stones. I'm an advanced powerboat instructor and examiner, a motor cruising yacht master instructor, cruising instructor trainer, and I also work for RYA Marine as a product assurance engineer. That doesn't mean I'm an expert in radar. I've spent the last 12 months working with charts. My use of radar has mainly been just like you guys as an instructor or as a skipper using radar in a practical environment. Also on the line we've got Craig Burton, who's in the background. He's going to answer questions on any sort of questions you guys ask over the text forum, whether it's technical questions, whether it's questions about the instructing side of things and the stuff that we go through. If there's anything that's common as we go through the session, then he'll pop it on the discussion on the panel to me, and I'll try and answer those to everybody if we can. Otherwise, Craig will try and keep on top of those things as we go through the session. So let's make a start. So purpose for the session is there's something on radar at pretty much every conference over the last few years. Most training boats in the sail cruising and the advanced schemes don't have radar, certainly on the sail cruising side. On the motor cruising side, they obviously have to. And there's a reason for that. Therefore, it's not covered very much in much detail by the instructors, but it's quite an important part of the course and the part of the exam, particularly as if they're going to go and work commercially, they're likely to end up on a boat that's got radar fitted, and therefore they're required to have an understanding of how to use it correctly. If we look, for example, at the advanced syllabus for the advanced exam, it details in there that they need to have knowledge of the use of electronic navigation, which includes GPS and radar. Under collision regulations, they should be able to apply the IRPCS, and they should be able to identify vessels by day and night, which certainly if we apply the rules, as per the rules, that means we need to know how to use the radar fitted to our vessel if it's got one. And we've got similar details in the Yachtmaster Offshore and the Yachtmaster Coastal exam syllabus as well. So what are we expecting our candidates to know for their exam? They should have an understanding of the setup, the basic controls, limitations of the radar, the different views and orientations we can have on there, how to use some of the functions such as an EBL or a VRM, how to use it for position fixing, how to interpret if there is a risk of collision, and then use it once we've established that to avoid a collision. And we may also want to learn, well, they should also understand some of the basic features that modern sets have got, such as MARPA, trails, target history, things like that, which can help us in the things above to interpret risk of collision and things like that. So that's what we're going to look at for the next 50 minutes through this session. So we'll start with some background stuff. So a lot of us, let's just go back a slide. I've got a little poll here which we'll set up. And what I'm going to do is ask you what level of instructor you are. So people can hopefully see that and can start answering it on their screens. Three people in so far, 66. I think all the results are in now, and we can see from that that most of us are actually teaching on boats or likely to be teaching on boats that don't have a radar fitted, whether we're in the powerboat and the advanced powerboat scheme or we're in the sail cruising scheme. There's a few motor cruisers amongst us in the room as well. So following on from that, let's ask another question. Given that we're teaching on, majority of us teaching on boats that don't have a radar or likely to not have a radar, how confident would we be to teach radar to our candidates? nearly everybody. That's probably about where I thought. We've used it a little bit, maybe we've learnt about it a little bit, but we'd like to know more. I think we'd all like to know more. So let's have a look at some of the stuff that we need to be covering. Some of this is going to be for you guys as background information, and some of it we'll talk about and we'll recap as we go through of what we would expect the level to be for our candidates on exams. So, sort of radars that we might find fitted to our boats. On the smaller boat, we're probably going to find a RYA dome, typically 18 to 24 or a 24-inch diameter. Most manufacturers seem to make them that size. Prices range from about 800 to about £3 grand when I've looked online at the prices between the different manufacturers. A lot of them state the range on these could be up to 50 miles, but that is pretty much dependent on the installation height. You're never going to install a radar high enough on a boat that we're on that will give you 50 miles range with one of these. It would need to be on the top of a cliff. It's line of sight, so we're typically looking at the horizon, so we're probably looking at, depending if we're mounting it on the back of a rib or the mast of a yacht, we're probably going to be looking at about 10 to 15 miles if we're lucky in terms of range on these, in terms of getting a good line of sight for it. Beam width on these is 3 to 5 degrees, and we'll come to that in a minute and why that's important, but just bear that figure in mind, 3 to 5 degrees beam width. Some of the newer ones can be fitted by radar, installed, and they talk to the chart plotter or whatever it's talking to by Wi-Fi, so that can save us on installation costs, so we don't need to take the rig down on our yacht to feed a wire down it maybe, and it saves weight as well of the cables going up the rig. And the modern radomes can be quite light, from as little as about 4 kilos. So it used to be they're quite heavy, and actually to put that up the top of a mast of a yacht or on the A-frame of a rib would be quite a heavy installation with all the fittings and the brackets and everything else. But the units themselves now are really lightweight, so that's becoming less of an issue for us. We move on to bigger boats, we're probably going to find one of these. If you ask someone to draw a radar, that's probably what they draw, an open array. So typically on our boats, 3, 4 or 6 foot diameter. On ships, they're going to be quite a lot bigger, quite a lot more pricey. The advertised range again on these is 100 miles, but again, it's going to be line of sight. If we can get it higher, it's going to see further. Important thing with these, 1 to 2 degree beam width again. They consume more power because of what's inside it and what it does, but they are starting to make more modern ones with solid state technology inside, which consumes a lot less power and is a lot lighter. But the traditional ones of these, we're probably looking at about 20 kilos, something like that for the weight, which means, that's quite a lot to have on the top of our radar arch on our motorboat. We wouldn't fit it on a yacht, so it's not an issue putting that weight up there. But typically on motorboats, about 40 foot upwards, where we've got a higher radar arch out of the way of people's heads and things like that, and we can carry the weight and the power that's required for it. Limitations of our radar. So the biggest issue is usually the user error, the person operating it. And typically we've got it on our boat and we turn it on once a year when we're crossing the channel, and we have a little play with it and we turn it off because it's nice and sunny. We've had a play with it for 10 minutes and that's it. We don't actually use it in situations where we might benefit from it and practice with it in good daylight, things like that. Incorrect settings, there's a lot to apply. We'll have a look at some of those as we go through. It can't see around corners. As I said, the line of sight is over the horizon. Similarly, it can't see around headlands. It can't see around harbour walls, things like that. And it takes time to fully understand and be able to operate it in a safe manner in order to assess risk of collision, use it safely for navigation, things like that. So, how good is the image going to be that we see on our screen? So I mentioned the beam width and also the pulse length, which is effectively to do with the wavelength of the signal that comes out of it, are the two things that are going to determine that. So the bearing resolution or the beam width We can't control that. It's determined by the set that we buy. So if we spend more and get an open array, we're going to get a narrow beam width. What that means is that as the signal comes out, as the unit spins around, if we've got a narrow beam width, it's going to see these two objects as single targets. So they'll show up as two single targets on our screen. If we've got a wider beam width, maybe 3 to 5 degrees, as this spins around, they're going to be within that signal as it sends it out and returns at the same time. So they're likely, or in fact they're going to show up as a single target. We won't be able to distinguish that there's two objects there. It could be two boats, it could be a boat next to a buoy, it could be two separate vessels, something like that, but they're going to show up as one target. Not much we can do about that. What we can alter is the range resolution, and that's controlled as we alter the range on the radar, which we'll look at in a second. With that, the wavelength, the pulse length of the signal that goes out changes. If we're on a short range, so we're only looking at things close to us, the pulse length is quite short. As we increase the range, it increases. Where this is going to affect it is if we got one object in front of us and there's another object behind it, we may not be able to see that, or some of it. If we've got a short pulse length, so on a short radar range, then we're going to see those two objects separate. If we increase the radar range, then those two objects may be coming back to us within the same pulse, the same signal that went out, and they'll show up as one object again. And we can alter that by having the right range set on our radar. Where we see the difference is where we look at two separate screens side by side. So on the left, we've got an array radar, and on the right, we've got a radome. You can see quite clearly that the one on the left has got a lot more smaller dots on it, a lot more returns, individual returns, whereas on here, they're blended into the harbour walls, they're blended into each other, etc. There's actually a channel coming up here, and on this one, you can't make it out particularly well because actually the harbour walls probably taken up on either side of it in the same signal that went out. And we'll look at another example of that in a second. So on the array radar, we've got a lot more detail that we can pick out. So we spend our money or we can fit it on a bigger boat and we're going to get a clearer signal. That doesn't mean that this is no use to us. We just have to bear in mind the limitations of it on the radome signal image. So here's another example of that. So this is the entrance to Langston Harbour. We're quite a way off here, good few miles out. And as the radar's gone around, the pulse, the beam width on here is wider as it scans around from that distance than the harbour entrance, or it's almost as wide, which is on the radar image. We're getting very little definition of that harbour entrance as it comes through. Which, if we're trying to identify that to navigate to it, is going to be it's going to prove to be difficult. As we get nearer, and instead of looking at it in a beam width that's this wide, we start to pick it up in the narrower section, then we're going to see it. Another example of that, so this is a wind farm down off Brighton. We've got wind turbines, they're 5 meters wide, they're 750 meters apart, and the beam width is blending them into one, but you can see the definition of them as we look further away from them. Actually, we can definitely define them by range, but not by bearing. So some of the basic controls on our radar. So I've got here to look at an actual radar. So things to work out that our students need to understand. Our radar can be off, or it can be on standby, or it can be transmitting. If it's off, it's cold, it's not warmed up, it's going to take potentially a while before it will actually start to operate. We could be looking at a minute or two between turning it on and it transmitting before we actually get an image on the screen. So if we think we'd like to use it, we should ideally have it on in standby, at least if we're not using it already. When we start transmitting, we're going to start to get an image on the screen. Once we've turned it on, we need to think about getting it set up so that we can use it So on all modern sets now, they'll have different modes, and that is sort of some predefined preset settings installed by the manufacturers, depending pretty much on where we are. If you think about it as how far away from land we're going to be. So we could be in harbour, where it's going to reduce the amount of clutter from land and things like that. We could be coastal if we're offshore. As we start to go further out, it's going to think that we're going to be in bigger waves, so it's going to adjust and have settings that will start to sort of try and filter out some of those bigger seas and sort of things that are going to cause us problems out there. Depending on the set we've got, it may also have some other settings, whether it's for weather, if we're looking for rain and stuff like that. It may have settings that will allow us to search for birds, which are good for fishermen, because if there's birds, there's probably fish underneath them. So it depends on the unit that we've got as to which settings it will have sort of pre-installed in there that we can choose. And what that's essentially doing is it's adjusting these controls to preset settings. We can then come in and we can set them differently. And the two that are going to be of particular concern to us is the gain. And what this is, it's a bit like the squelch on your VHF radio. If we turn it down, then it's going to give us lots of returns, and we're going to get lots of noise on the screen. It's going to show up pretty much everything it receives. As we start to adjust this, we can start to filter out some of that noise, and we just get the stronger signals. The danger is we turn it up too much, and we don't see the smaller signals, maybe some of these smaller ones, which actually may be things that are a concern to us, and we just filter them out by turning up the gain too much. The other one that we'll need to consider is if we're looking at a colour radar image, is the colour gain, and what that does, it determines how strong a signal has to be before it turns red, or whatever colour they're using for the strong return, to show up as a strong signal. The smaller ones will remain yellow in this example, but as we turn that up, it will determine whether we get bigger or smaller returns returned as a strong signal on the screen, a bit like the volume. Our other setting that we're going to play with is our range, and that is telling us essentially how far it is from the center where we are to the top of the screen. And as I start to adjust the range in or out, I've got indication down here as I zoom in or as I zoom out. That's the distance from me to the top of the screen. Inside of that, to help me use this for navigation and other observational assessing where things are, I've got the range rings, and they adjust according to the range. And as I said, the longer the range, the longer the signal is going to be. If I'm somewhere, let's say I'm in the salt and I've got my range set at 10 miles, I might see what's down, past the needles if I'm at cows, but that's probably not much use to me. But the danger is, because of that adjustment of the pulse length, as I mentioned, I'm not going to maybe pick up things that are close to me, like buoys and boats, as individual targets. They're going to blend into one because of that pulse length issue. So if I set the range according to where I am and actually where the concern is to me, come in a bit, that's probably going to give me a better image that's easier to understand. So back to my presentation. The other filters I had on there are the rain. So rain will show up, the signal will bounce off the water particles in the air, and that will give me a lot of interference on the radar. What I don't know is whether there's things hidden under here, which could be things I need to see, boats, buoys, things like that, or even land, like I can see up here. So adjusting the rain filter will affect the whole image, and it will reduce that interference from the rain. It may have an auto setting, but I may need to just tune that myself as well. And that will help me see the things that are important to me. Here's an image of a lot of rain coming in. So again, if I can, I want to get rid of that so I can see what's underneath it. The sea clutter does a similar thing with the waves. The radar signal, the pulse, will bounce off the water. So if there's big waves around, it'll bounce off the face of the waves, and it'll give us things that show up on the radar screen. And by adjusting the sea clutter again, I'm either in amongst a lot of small boats here, or there's a lot of mooring buoys around, or it's probably sea clutter. So stuff like this is probably going to be the sea. So if I adjust that C clutter, it'll get rid of this, and it'll just give me the things that remain, which are probably boats and buoys. So some of these stronger ones will probably remain on screen. Get rid of all these smaller ones. So once I'm operating, I need to think about which way up I've got the orientation of the screen. So my radar is pretty simple. The radar on its own, it knows which direction it's facing, and it assumes therefore that the boat's facing in the same direction. And we've mounted it somewhere near the center line pointing forwards. We can set it, if it's a couple of degrees out, we can adjust that so that it's actually facing, the heading line on here points towards where the boat's actually facing. So the simplest view that we can have is head up. And as the boat swings around and we turn in different directions, the radar image will turn on the screen as well. Great for collision avoidance, because as we look out the window, if we see a boat on our port side out the window, it's probably going to appear on the port side on the radar screen. And as we turn, and that boat then turns onto our starboard side, it will move on here as well. It's what we call an unstabilized view, and what that means essentially is that it's going to alter a lot. As we turn, that'll turn, the land will move with it, and we'll get a lot of smearing across the screen as it starts to repaint. And it can be difficult to use if we're changing course a lot, and the boat's pitching and rolling and we're not steering a steady course through waves and things like that. In simple use, it's great for collision avoidance, because what we see is what we get out the window. Our other option is we could be looking at head up, and this is good for navigation particularly, because north up we're looking at here. North is up the screen. That is exactly as we're going to have our paper chart out in front of us, and we'll have a heading line which shows us which direction we're driving across the chart, driving across the radar screen, driving across our paper chart as well, so we can see which direction we're heading along our course. It's a bit harder to interpret with collision avoidance, because we need to try and imagine ourselves driving along this line, particularly if we're heading south. It becomes quite confusing. From a navigation point of view, it's a lot easier to orientate ourselves relative to land and buoys and everything else if we're looking at the view in this way. It can be stabilized in two ways. It will either need a heading sensor on our boat, which is reliable, which is accurate, or it can be stabilized by our course over the ground from the GPS. What we need to remember there is that if the boat's stopped, you haven't got a course over the ground because the boat's not moving, so you won't be able to get a north up image, because it won't know which way is north. It's only once the boat starts to move and it understands that you're traveling at 250 degrees, as you are in this one, it then knows which way round to paint the radar image on the screen. So cog is useful, but it needs the boat to be moving, and it needs a fairly steady course over the ground for that. So moving slowly, again, it could be an issue, or altering course quite a bit. It's going to take a while to keep up. If you're using a heading, that needs to be reliable as well. We've all been on boats where there's quite an error in the heading as we see the readout on the autopilot display or something, or whatever it's showing us. We look at that, we compare it to our cog or to our compass heading, because of the error that's within there. So we need to understand, we need to try and have that set up correctly with an accurate and reliable heading source coming into it in order to get this to work correctly and accurately. The other option we can have is course up. So this is using so this is what we call a stabilized image as well. So as the boat changes direction, the radar image will stay steady, similar to north up. As the boat heading changes, just the heading line will move. On course up, it will do the same. So when we turn it into course up, what it will do is it'll look at which direction the boat's moving, and it will paint that up the screen, a bit like head up. But what happens now is the radar image stays stable. As we move direction, all that changes is the heading line. So the land stays stationary, the buoys, things like that. We can see other vessels. And as we move, we'll hopefully see that as we move, we'll move across where the other vessels are, it's easier to understand than north up for collision avoidance, and it gives us a bit of a compromise between the two for navigation and collision avoidance. If we make a big alteration, of course, what we'll need to do is reset that image, and there could be a button on the screen, or we could just need to enter course up mode again so that it paints us heading up the screen again. Otherwise we get into that confusion of driving down the screen, which we could have had in north up if that's the thing we don't like and don't understand very easily. Again, use this cog or heading to set this up. So coming back to my chart plotter, which I've got in front of me. So this is an actual chart plotter on my desk, which obviously I use for work every day. It's through into my computer in order to be able to replay the screen that's on it. If you've got one of these in your classroom, then you can connect it either via apps or through a cable. There's ways to do that. Get in touch if you want to know. Just seen that question come up on the chat there from Craig. So moving on from the orientation and things, one of the useful controls and useful features on this for navigation and for collision avoidance is what we call the EVL or the VRM function. And what that allows us to do is measure distance and measure direction from our vessel to some of the things that we see on the screen. And what that then allows us to do is use that information either for plotting a position if we want to mark a distance, if we want to see roughly how far, guess if something's a buoy or a boat, or if we want to monitor something's progress, we can use this function. And it gives us two things. It gives us the distance and it gives us a bearing. At the moment, that is giving us a relative bearing to our heading. So that's telling me something 60 degrees on my port side. So if I look out the window, roughly 60 degrees, so about 10 o'clock, out my port window, I'm probably going to see whatever that object is, 1.6 miles away. Similarly, if I swing it the other way, it will give me that relative bearing to starboard. That is not much use on a compass unless I know my heading and I combine the heading and the bearing that it's given me here to then use that on my hand bearing compass. I can set it up alternatively for this to give me a compass bearing. That's harder if I'm just then trying to look out the window and work out roughly how far out each side of the boat something is. So I can either have a compass bearing here or I can have a relative. The other thing I can do with this is I can offset this. If I want to measure the distance between two objects, so I want to measure from there across to here, I can measure how far it is using that offset VRM and EVL function. And most of them will allow me to set two of these, and they'll show up in different colours. Pretty useful. I'll show some examples of where we're going to use that in just a second. So, different ways we can use the radar. We could use it for position fixing. So as we said, easiest in Northup because it matches the chart. So for most of us, that's going to be the easiest orientation. Range and bearing from a known object gives us a rough position. What we need to consider with the bearing of something is that beam width, which I mentioned. So if I come back to my radar screen, if I look at this target here, which is quite wide, where do I measure that angle to? Do I measure it to this side, or somewhere in the middle? I'm probably going to assume that whatever I'm looking at and whatever it is in the middle of that. But to measure that accurately with this, I need to try and position it somewhere within that. And if it's jumping around, that's going to be quite difficult. However, the range stays fairly constant. As my heading changes a little bit, the range stays roughly the same unless I'm getting close to it. But the bearing can swing around a lot. So my bearing needs to take into account that the beam width and, am I steering a straight course? Distance is a lot more accurate. So similar as to way I could do with a hand bearing compass on a paper chart, I could do a 3-point fix. I could do a 3-point fix with radar range, marking off with my dividers to put my position and plot my position on the chart. I could use a chart radar overlay as a quick way of just fixing my position, and probably more importantly, confirming our GPS position. The GPS is pretty good. It gives us our GPS position at least every second. So there's probably little reason to not believe it, unless we think for any reason there's any error in it. And probably one of the easiest ways of confirming that is if we do a radar overlay and the land matches up with the land won't have moved. So we're probably where the actual boat position is shown on the screen by the chart plotter, if everything else around us matches up. We can use it when we're underway. So if we're navigating in poor visibility, in the dark, or even just in the daylight, we want to just confirm position, whether it's somewhere to turn around a headland and we want to be a certain distance off, we want to be a certain bearing from something before we make a turn. What we may have set up is something like I've got on the right here. So I've set up here a range ring. So I'm traveling up here at the moment towards the shore, and I want to make a turn up Southampton Water up here to be clear of this channel in the dark. So what I've done, I've set up a range ring, and that's going to tell me when that hits the land over here, that's going to tell me that I'm a certain distance that I've set, 1.1 miles, I think I guessed it as here, from the land, and that puts me somewhere here in shallower water. So I've cleared that channel. What I've also got is a bearing line here. And as the boat moves, that's going to move up the radar image, and when it hits the end of Calshot Spit, that tells me that I'm on that bearing that I chose from Calshot Spit, and I'm that distance from the shore, so I must be somewhere in the shallow water about here. That when those two line up, that gives me an indication that I'm probably at my waypoint as well, and therefore I can make the turn to head up this way and be clear of the channel and other vessels that are within there. So really useful, simple tools that I can just adjust on the screen, and I can just leave them on the screen as the boat's traveling. Once they reach the point where I want to be, that'll be exactly where, that'll put me exactly where I want to be to turn. I can also use it if I want to stay at a certain distance from the shore. So maybe running down this headland and I want to keep at least 0.3, 0.4 of a mile off the shore to stay out of the shallow water, stay away from rocks, fishing pots, things like that. So as well as monitoring the chart, what I can do is I can set a range ring at a certain distance that I've chosen. It's my, the minimum distance I want to get to that shore, and as long as that circle is away from that land, that keeps me out far enough offshore in the area that I want to be in. Dead simple tools that I can just set up really easily on the radar image. Okay, something when we start to move to collision avoidance that's important to understand is the target reference mode, and whether we're in what we call true or relative. So our radar is really simple. It assumes that it's pointing in the direction that the boat's traveling. It sends a signal out, and hopefully it gets a return. It knows how far away that object was, and it knows what direction it was relative to my vessel. And it will paint it on the screen. What it can do is it can remember where that object was, and it can watch it again. And it can watch it again, and it will see it moving, whether it's moving, whatever direction it's moving. And what that's giving us is a position relative to our vessel, relative to the direction we're facing. It's giving us a bearing and a distance to that object. Once we start to use some of the other features, it will show us the history of that, and it will guess which direction that object's moving, and that will be relative to us, relative to our vessel. That's something that for us sat in the boat is quite difficult to work out. We can get a rough direction, we can guess a rough distance. This is pretty accurate at that. What it's hard for us to do is work out roughly where that vessel is moving relative to us. Is it going to pass ahead or astern? We could use a hand bearing compass and monitor it, but the radar's a little bit better at it than we are. And what it will give us on the screen is some vectors if we start to monitor that. So if we tell it to follow a target on my radar, it's dead simple. I just get out, out. I select somewhere on the screen and I acquire that target. What it'll do now is it'll monitor that object and it will work out the direction it's moving and the speed it's moving to start with relative to us. And it will then start to paint that on the screen for us. And what it's telling us is that this object here, number 2, for instance, is moving in that direction relative to us. This one is moving this direction relative to us. In the next, I think they're probably set up at 6-minute intervals here. Similarly here. My concern on here is things that are moving towards the center of the screen, moving directly towards me. Relative to me, that's moving directly towards where I am. So there's probably going to be, there may be a crash here. What it doesn't tell me is actually what they're doing in real life. It doesn't give me an impression of what they're doing off the ground. So relative is just telling what they're doing relative to us. It's great for collision avoidance and collision sort of, assessment. But what I don't know from here is which direction these are actually traveling. So this one here, he may be traveling this way. He may be traveling this way, but we're coming up and we're getting closer to him. Is this one traveling this way, or is he just traveling this way, but we're going a lot faster than him? So relative to us, we're overtaking him. So it looks like he's traveling backwards relative to us, or is he actually traveling in that direction behind us? It's difficult to understand which direction they're moving and which direction they're facing from a relative image. But what it does do is gives us a really quick understanding of, are we about to crash or potentially going to crash? So here we've got an image of the heading out the front of a vessel. We've got a ship on the horizon 2 miles away. We can see him on the radar screen, but the relative vector shows that if we keep going where we're going and he keeps doing what he's doing, he's going to pass down our port side down here. As we get closer and he travels further left, he's going to pass down this side of our vessel. We've got another one coming from further up. I think he's just about there. And again, if everything stays the same, he's going to pass ahead of us. So relative to us, these aren't a concern to us. And that's just the same sort of impression we get if we watched it with a hand bearing compass out the window or lined it up with 2 objects like we teach people to do. What this hasn't told us is what side of the vessel we're looking at. So are we looking at his port side or his starboard side in order to interpret that collision risk? More importantly, are we stand on or give way? Just a second. What we've got on this image that helps us with that is the AIS overlay. And that tells us that he is facing in that direction, so we must be looking at his port side. So that's great. If we haven't got AIS, we need to try and interpret it from the radar to determine if we're looking at his port or starboard side. And that's where true reference mode comes in. And what that requires is a reliable input of speed and cog and heading. They need to be accurate. Speed and cog are probably going to be pretty good from our GPS, but what we need is for this to be accurate and to be usable and safe, we need a good, reliable heading source, which is correct on every heading within a degree or 2 at the most. If we're looking at 10 degrees of difference, we're going to get some quite funny figures, quite incorrect information coming out of this sort of vectors and trails and things that it will start to show us. If we haven't got that stuff, what we're going to need to do is then try and work it out ourselves, and that's where historically we've taught people to use the RYA plotting sheets and things like that to use the information that tells us where something is relative to us to then calculate which direction it's moving, so that we can then make that decision of, is he port side to us or starboard side? Which side of him are we looking at? Are we looking at stern because he's moving away from us? it's easy for plotting things on the chart and working out perspective of the vessels. So what does that do? If we look at the two combined next to each other, we've got a chart on our left, and that's got radar overlay on it, and we've got the same target selected, and we've got true vectors on the one on the left, got relative vectors on the one on the right. This is actually coming up past the entrance to Bewley. So I've got a number of vessels coming out the river, some of which I'm thinking, okay, I'm about to cross the front of these. And if this was poor visibility, I might see them on the radar, and I may not actually see them out the window. So I've picked out these targets, and I need to work out, okay, what's going on? Who's the giveaway vessel? Who's the stand on? What we're going to do. True vectors, this gives us the impression there's going to be a crash here, because if he keeps going, that's the actual direction he's going to go, towards that red mark there. Similarly, these are coming this way. This is probably a vessel coming this way. But what the relative vectors have done is they've used our movement and their movement to take into consideration what's happening. And this tells us that these are going to pass down our port side. If everything stays the same, they're going to pass behind us. We're going to pass up here before they get down here. What this doesn't tell us is, are we looking at the port side of that object or the starboard side of that object? And that's where the true stuff comes in and is useful. However, this requires accurate information in order to be able to calculate that correctly, as I said. True and relative vectors. If we have got a more modern set, it may have Doppler radar. So this, most manufacturers make these now, not just RYA Marine. Garmin, Furuno do them as well, and Simrad. What this does, it takes out some of that guesswork for us. So on the screen, things that are moving towards us are shown as red, things that are moving away from us are green. So that our main concern, if it's not moving, generally it's more than 3 knots, it requires it to be moving up to show it in one of these colours. So buoys and land will stay painted out in this example just as grey. Our main concern from a moving vessel point of view, that doesn't mean these aren't a danger, because there is something there, are the red and the greens. They're the ones that are going to be a concern to us. And from that, I'm then going to concentrate on those and work out what I need to do about them. So, using the radar for collision avoidance. Simplest way to monitor something and decide if there's going to be a crash, if we've not got the vectors turned on, as I showed earlier, is to set an EBL up and put it on a target, so this one here, and just monitor it. If that target stays on that line on the same constant bearing, but is getting closer to the center of the image, which is where I am, that means there is a risk of collision. If we had the vectors turned on, there'd be an orange line down this one as well, assuming it's on this set. Because relative to me, he's moving directly towards me. So a simple EBL, same as you would monitoring a compass, calls out the side of the boat. An EBL monitoring that object will help us to determine if there's a risk of collision, because he's on a constant bearing and he's getting closer to us. Sorry, wrong screen. So let's have a look at what the rules talk about. So rule 5 says we need to keep a good lookout by all available means, appropriate to the prevailing conditions. So our students need to understand, our exam candidates need to understand that all available means includes radar if fitted and where appropriate. And they need to have a knowledge of how to monitor targets, range and bearing using VRM, using the EBL, as we just talked about, to assess if there's a risk of collision. Traveling at a safe speed, it's quite a long rule, this one. And the bit that's particularly important to us is part B of this one. Additionally, by vessels with radar. So there's lots of particular important bits of regulation in here, but the important bit is that they need to consider how that's going to affect our ability to monitor sea state, to monitor traffic density, rain, etc., when determining what a safe speed is. So if we've got it, that could help us to monitor the situation, to monitor these factors, and that may determine what our safe speed is on our vessel according to what's around us. Because we've got a better picture of what's going on around us, it may be suitable to travel a little bit faster, or it may actually make us slow down a bit because we can see more by monitoring what's on the radar and getting more of an interpretation of what's going on. In terms of establishing if a risk of collision exists, what we need to understand is that actually we need to be able to use it properly. We need to have accurate information, and from that we need the right inputs, we need the right settings, etc. We need to understand that not everything's going to show up on radar, particularly with vessels. What are they made from? Some show up better than others, and we may not see them. And we need to understand whether things have got radar reflectors or not, and actually whether they're going to show up very easily. So that's going to help us to determine how easily can we see things, but by using the things we talked about, using an EBL, things like that, that's going to help maybe the target settings to show vectors and trails of vessels. That's going to help us determine if there's a risk of collision. Action to avoid a collision. This is quite a long rule list and quite complicated, but probably the most important bit is that any alteration of course we make needs to be really obvious to another vessel on his radar. So he needs to be able to observe us make a big change of course. If he's got vectors up, that should give him a big alteration of the direction of that vector. If he's got trail set up, he'd see a big curve in our trail. If he's just looking at targets, then he's going to see a big change in the direction of our target on the screen relative to where he is. Rule 19 is probably where the radar is going to be the most useful. Now, assuming we can see other vessels, then we're probably going to apply all the other rules that we've talked about. Where this is particularly important in Rule 19 is the bit that the students need to understand, is that if we can't see the other vessel and we only detect it by radar, and we from that determine that there is going to be a risk of collision, or there's a risk of collision developing, it tells us what action we should take. And this really is about just keeping us safe and not making the situation worse, and I guess buying us time to make a better informed decision as we can monitor the situation for longer. And this is the sort of thing our students need to understand. They're quite likely to be asked about this on an exam, about what we should do in this situation and why we should do it. Okay. Essentially, we should be turning to starboard for all situations, apart from if we detect a vessel on our starboard quarter, because what we don't know there is whether he's coming in this direction behind us. Is he coming up this way to overtake us? And by turning to starboard, we're potentially going to make the situation worse. In this situation, we would, if it's only detected by radar, turn to port, so that if he's coming up to overtake us, we turn away from him over here, rather than turn across his bow. If he's coming this way, across our stern, maybe in this direction, then actually we're going to start to run parallel with him. So again, something important for our students to understand. To help with that stuff, modern sets have, modern sets has been in radars for years, but it's become more common in small craft radars and what they can do compared to what sort of radars for larger craft, which have had this sort of stuff for a lot longer. So most sets now will show us what we call trails, which gives us essentially a snail trail, a history of where a vessel's been. And what it gives us essentially is more information about what's going on. If we just see a target on the screen without watching it consciously, it's difficult to see where it's going and what it's doing, and monitor and use that information to determine if there's a risk of collision. But the trails can give us a lot more information to be able to do that in simple terms. So what it's showing us is how an object, or where an object has been moving. This one's set up in true, so the land won't have a trail. It's got a small trail, but that is just from the movement of our heading, most likely. Stationary objects like buoys, again, they shouldn't have much of a trail apart from a small sort of cloud around them. But the ones with a long trail, these are going to be vessels. And it gives us an indication of which direction they're moving and how fast. The faster it's moving, the longer the trail it's going to have over that period of 30 seconds or whatever that time period was that we've set it to show. If it's set to relative, then everything's going to have a trail because everything is moving relative to our position where we were previously. So that shows trails over land, off buoys and things like that. And we've got to then try and pick out the trails of the things that are slightly longer on boats and things like that. So this gives us a simpler view with relative the true trails of just the objects that are moving. If we try and look at that on an image, so here we've got a chart with AIS overlay on the left, and we've got a radar screen on the right with true trails set up. I've picked out a few targets already, which I saw were moving, and the radar's monitored them using its MAPA information. And what it's telling us is that we've got a few vessels moving. We've got one at 27 knots, one at 7, and one at 5, and it gives us the direction that they're moving. And that's a true heading. So if we were to plot that on the chart, that would be straight on the compass. And what it's picked up, so this is a long trail, I can see that, and it's telling me that information. And if I looked at the AIS information for that vessel, it's the hovercraft going to South Sea. That is matching exactly pretty much what the radar had calculated as well. Stationary objects will have no trail, so there's a buoy there. Slow moving vessel, it's got a short trail. And if I was to pick that as a target, it would then give me the speed of it. Here's an object that's showing up on my radar, but very small. That was a big wooden vessel, Jolly Breeze. It's about 80-90 foot. It's a wooden sail training vessel, but he showed up very small because of his construction. He was stopped at the time. Luckily, he's got AIS as well. Here we've got two buoys, two posts, and they're showing up as a single target. And that is, again, remember the beam width, blending them into one. So it could be a large object or it could be two small ones. Here I've got a vessel traveling inwards, showing on AIS, so that helps me to eliminate that target. Again, spit pank, again, big objects, but not moving. Lots of them. Here's the buoys in pairs, the channel markers. But what is of concern to me is things that aren't on AIS, but they're moving on the radar screen. So these vessels down here and these two at the bottom, they've not got AIS. If it was night time, I may not see them out the window, but I can see that there's a moving object there on the radar screen. So I've started to track them, and I can then get information about their speed and their heading to then work out what I need to do to reduce that risk of collision. So this is where radar comes into its own over AIS, and what I can see out the window is that it shows me everything that's there in poor visibility at night. Doesn't matter what the conditions are. The radar tells me what it can actually see. So these are my concerns in this particular moment. Okay. So in summary, lots of useful features on radar for navigation and collision avoidance. In poor visibility, it really comes into its own. It could be our only way of seeing what's out there. Radar overlay on the chart helps to identify buoys and other charted objects, and it helps to reduce things that I need to try and guess. Is it a boat? Is it a buoy? Is it land? Whatever it is. So the overlay will help to eliminate those things. Anything that's left out, so I've got rid of those things, is probably going to be a boat. An AIS overlay can help with that as well. A split screen chart radar can help that as well. And having the two next to each other, as we've just seen on that previous slide. It takes some understanding and some practice to start to identify what things are. Practicing is good, and practicing good conditions in order to get familiar with it. You can see things on the radar, you can look out the window and see that there's actually something there. Is it a boat or is it a buoy? The worst thing is to turn this on in the dark in poor visibility, restricted visibility when we actually need it, and having not used it, is to actually, and then try and guess what it's showing us, having not used the settings for a long time. So practice with it and get familiar with it. Something to get our students in the mindset of doing. So what do we expect our students to know? The things we mentioned earlier, the things we've just discussed. How to set it up, how to use it, how to view it, the features it can give us, EBLs, VRMs, really useful for positioning, for position work and for collision avoidance. How to interpret a risk of collision, so we can work out if there's going to be a collision, but what they need to understand as well is how to determine what they're going to do from it. So as well as using the relative features to work out if there's going to be a collision, they need to somehow get that information about whether there is going to be, whether they're stand on or give way, and therefore they need to understand what aspect they're looking at, which may come from true vectors or true trails on the radar. If they can't get that information accurately, then they may need to start plotting things, as we've tended to teach them for a long time. But the stuff on modern sets, the trails, the history, the marker details, that can help to make that our life a lot easier with determining that risk of collision. They don't need to be experts, they just need to understand that these things exist and how it can be used. And if they're going to use a radar, they need to understand and appreciate that they may need to get more training and better understanding of how to use it. Something that's worth thinking about is how we use radar plotting sheets on exams, and whether we actually need to use them at all. If we were to think as an instructor, an examiner, or probably more importantly as a skipper away from an RYA course or an exam, when was the last time you actually used one of these things? And the answer is probably a very long time ago, or even probably never at all. So is it fair or right that we're examining students on whether they can complete one of these? And yes, it can give us a fairly good idea of whether they understand what's going on inside the thing, but actually it's more important that they can operate the radar and interpret what's on the actual screen rather than one of these things. So probably more appropriate to show them a screenshot or a picture of a real radar screen, or even better, get them to use the actual radar on the boat if we've got one. If we're going to use one of these because we've nothing else, then probably the most we'd expect them to be able to do is calculate a true heading and speed, and therefore what aspect we're looking at of the other vessel in order to fully understand the collision situation. We're not expecting them to calculate CPAs and TCPAs and more complex things like that, because actually once they go away from the exam, in real life, they're never going to use one of these things. What's more important, as we said, is that they can understand what's actually happening on a modern radar, because that's what they're going to use. And if that's set up correctly, it's going to give us a lot better estimation of that collision situation than trying to work out one of these, which has probably taken them 10 minutes. And in that 10 minutes to do the calculation, the vessel's changed course, it's changed heading, the other vessel's changed course and changed heading. And actually what they've calculated is no longer actually what is happening outside in the real world, but the radar has done those calculations instantly and is now telling us what's actually happening now. So use these with caution. So they should be prepared to answer questions on any of the stuff we've talked about, maybe not as in depth as we just talked about. And ideally they should be able to interpret a simple radar screen. They're not expected to be experts, as we said, but they should have a basic understanding. If they've got no radar knowledge whatsoever, then that may be the grounds for a partial reset, if we think that's achievable. If they've got no radar image or a little bit of radar image, but there's lots of other extra areas that are weak, then that may be a fail. And that's down to you as the examiner to make that decision. Some further reading that's useful for you and for your students. And that's the end of the session. The slides will go out on the Instructor Resources website. And what I'll do is I'll tag on lots of radar images that I've got. You've seen a few already, but I've got lots of others with collision situations, with navigational situations, and I'll tag them on the end of the PowerPoint, this PowerPoint, so that they can be pulled out by instructors, by examiners to use as resources for teaching and for examining. Hopefully that will be useful than trying to sort of make up and find your own resources. That's it for the end of the session. Thank you very much. Any questions, Molly, that have come in over the session, which we can answer?
I think the only other unanswered questions is to do with your simulators. Are they specific to RYA Marine, and are they available for people?
So this simulator is, it's an actual chart plotter. It's sat on my desk next to me. It's what I use every day for work. There isn't a sort of simulator version of that available. We have talked about it a few times, but it's getting the resources for us to make that, and I guess other manufacturers as well. If centres have got a chart plotter in their classroom, then there are ways to connect it. So this is connected via a cable to my laptop through the network connector. You can connect it using mobile apps to tablets and things like that, which you can project onto the screen and then just operate the chart plotter as I was, just by using the screen. So things like the RYA Viewer app onto a tablet or a phone, which you can then project onto a TV or a projector in a classroom, is one way to do it. It depends on the unit you've got and what the manufacturer allows, but there isn't an actual a specific simulator. There are some computer-based simulators for radar, but they're pretty dated, which is probably what we used to see in classrooms. However, they're probably a lot cheaper than buying a chart plot. But if we can get second-hand ones, or they've come off a boat and there's ways to connect it and view it in a classroom, then quite often this is just the simulator, the retail demo mode that would normally be on display on the boat show stand. And it's got all the functionality of a radar, and you can control all the settings and the menus and things like that to show students. So if they've got old sets, maybe they've replaced one on their boat and they've got the older unit, that's probably more use than a computer simulator.
Perfect, thanks Graham. And one final question for you. Do modern CHIRP radars have better discrimination?
So a chirp radar, yeah, so that's to do with the signals that come out of it and the processing that it does. They'll give us a lot better definition than an older traditional type, more traditional type radar. So it gives us better definition of the images, essentially, of the targets, and small things will show up with smaller things and stuff like that. It just helps us to identify big things from little things a little bit better, or even see them at all.
Perfect, thank you very much. I think that's all the questions.
Cool, thank you very much.